The carriage had not yet stopped when the rain began, and the woman in the grey cloak stepped down into the mud of the Wexford courtyard as though she had every right to be there. She was old, or she had made herself look old. Her shoulders bowed beneath a mantle worn thin at the elbows, her boots split at the seam. A basket of damp kindling clutched against her hip. No one at the great house knew her face. That was precisely as she had arranged it. She had come a long way to see what her son's house had become, and she meant to see it honestly, which meant she could not be seen as herself. At the servants' door she gave a name that was not her name, and asked, in the flat voice of a woman who had begged before, whether there might be work for a pair of hands through the wet season. The footman looked at her cloak, at the kindling, at the rain dripping from the hem of her skirt onto the clean stone, and he very nearly sent her round to the road again. Eleanor Vance was crossing the passage behind him with a tray of tea things, and she stopped. And Eleanor said the thing that decided everything that followed. She said the woman should come in out of the cold before she took a chill, and she said it as though it were the most ordinary sentence in the world. To the household of Wexford, Eleanor was a companion, and very little else. She had arrived in the spring to attend the Duke's intended bride, a position halfway between servant and ornament, paid in lodging and the occasional cast-off glove. She did not expect to be seen. She expected to endure. What she did not yet know was that the old woman she had just pulled in from the rain would, within the fortnight, undo everything the house believed about itself, and that Eleanor's small kindness in a cold passage would be the first thing the woman wrote down in the ledger she kept behind her eyes. The dowager, for that is what the woman in rags truly was, allowed herself to be led to the kitchen fire, and given a stool and a cup of the very tea she had once poured for kings. She watched the girl move. She noted that Eleanor served the lowest scullery maid before she served herself, that she knew every name below stairs, that she carried herself with the straight spine of someone raised to a station she no longer held. The dowager had not lived 63 years at the center of society without learning to read a person the way other women read a card of fashion plates. This one had been a lady once. This one was a lady still, whatever the household ledgers said. The girl had hands that had learned work late. The dowager saw the calluses new, over fingers that had once known only a needle and the cool ivory of piano keys. She watched Eleanor coax the green wood in the grate into catching, watched her wipe the soot from her palm onto her apron rather than her skirt, watched her pause to set a stool nearer the fire for the old woman. Without being asked, and without comment, as though comfort were simply a thing one arranged for others as a matter of course, the dowager had been waited upon by the finest servants in 3 kingdoms and had never once been served by someone who seemed to forget, in the serving, that she was being watched at all. There was no performance in the girl. That more than the straight spine or the careful diction was what told the dowager she had stumbled onto something the house did not know it possessed. You may have known a woman like this, the one the room decides not to look at. Stay with me, because the looking is about to begin in earnest. Henry, the Duke of Wexford, had not wanted a wife. He had wanted the matter settled, which is a different thing, and he had let it be settled for him, because settling it required no part of the heart he had locked away 3 winters before. His mother had gone abroad after the funeral and had not written, and the house had grown cold in her absence in a manner that had nothing to do with the fires. Into that cold the Bellamy family had moved, with the precision of a fleet finding an undefended harbor. Miss Cassandra Bellamy was beautiful in the way of polished silver, and her mother was relentless. And between them they had secured an understanding with the Duke before he had quite decided to give one. Cassandra came down to the morning room each day at 11, dressed as though for a portrait, and she had a particular way of not seeing the people who served her. She did not see Eleanor when Eleanor brought her chocolate. She did not see the old beggar woman at all, except once, on the second morning when she found the woman dusting the hall and stopped to say, in a voice pitched to Carrie, that she could not think why such a creature had been let into the house and that she would speak to the housekeeper about standards. The dowager kept her eyes down and her hands moving, and said nothing. She was, after all, gathering wool, and wool was best gathered in silence. That night, Eleanor found the old woman sitting alone in the cold of the back stair, and she brought her a blanket without being asked. And she sat with her a while, because the woman seemed to want the company and would not say so. They spoke of small things, the weather, the price of candles, whether the roses in the south garden would survive the frost. The dowager asked lightly, as though it were nothing, what the companion made of her mistress, and Eleanor was quiet for a moment before she answered that it was not her place to make anything of anyone, and that Miss Bellamy would no doubt be a fine duchess. The dowager noticed that the girl's loyalty cost her something to give. She noticed, too, that the girl gave it anyway. That was the second entry in the ledger. To understand why Eleanor would not speak ill of a woman who did not see her, you must understand what Eleanor had lost. She had been born Eleanor Caro, the only daughter of a gentleman whose estate lay 40 miles north in country the Duke had never visited. Her father had died owing money to men who collected it with documents rather than fists, and the estate had been sold over her head before the year of mourning was out, and the cousin who inherited what little remained had made it gently clear that there was no room in his house for a portionless girl with opinions. She had taken the companion's post because it was the only door that opened. She had told no one at Wexford who she had been. A companion with a history was a companion with heirs, and a companion with heirs did not keep her place. She kept, folded in the lining of her workbox, the one thing she had carried out of her father's house. It was a letter, the last he had written her, and it had in it a sentence she read on the nights when the house felt most like a cage. He had written that she was worth more than the sum of what she would inherit, and that any man who could not see it was not worth the seeing. She had not yet met a man who could see it. She did not expect to. The Duke came down to the stables on the third morning, and Eleanor was there, because Cassandra had sent her to fetch a riding crop she had decided at the last moment she did not want. And the errand had been designed, as Cassandra's errands often were, to be both pointless and visible. The Duke found his intended's companion standing in the cold, with a crop she had not asked for, and no instruction as to what to do with it, and he watched her for a moment with an expression that gave nothing away. Then he asked her name. She told him. He said it back to her once, as though filing it somewhere, and he said that she should go inside before she froze, and the words came out as an order, because orders were the only shape his voice knew how to make. Eleanor heard the coldness. She did not hear the thing underneath it, which was that he had noticed she had no gloves. That was the way of him. He gave commands that were built like walls and meant like windows, and the people around him saw only the stone. His mother, watching from the shadow of the tack-room door in her beggar's cloak, saw both. She had built him, after all. She knew the architecture. The household settled into the rhythm of the engagement, and the rhythm was not kind to Eleanor. Cassandra had begun to understand, in the way that the cruel understand without examining it, that the companion was admired below stairs in a manner she herself was not, and Cassandra did not care to be second in any room, even the kitchen. She found small ways to remind Eleanor of her station: a gown that needed mending by morning, a walk in the wet for ribbon that was not wanted, a correction, delivered before company, of an error Eleanor had not made. The other servants saw it. The old beggar woman, on her knees by the grate, saw all of it, and her hands grew still on the brushes more than once. And she had to remind herself that she was here to learn the truth before she acted on it, not to fly to its defense the moment it bruised. The dismissive word arrived on the 5th day, and it arrived in Cassandra's own mouth, in the morning room, before her mother and a visiting cousin. They had been speaking of the wedding and of who should attend, and the cousin had asked idly whether the companion might be given a small place at the breakfast that followed, since she had been so useful. Cassandra had laughed a light and practiced sound, and she had said that one did not seat the help among the guests, and that Eleanor was a charity case her mother had taken on out of softness. Nothing more, a charity case. The words landed in the room and sat there. Eleanor, who had come in with the post and could not now retreat without being seen to retreat, set the letters down and left without a word, and her spine did not bend, and the only betrayal of her was a flush that climbed her throat and a tremor in the hand that closed the door. The Duke was in the library when she passed it, and the library door was open, and he had heard. He said nothing. Eleanor walked the length of the cold corridor to the back stairs before she let herself stop, one hand flat against the paneling, and she stood there a moment, teaching her breath to be even again. Charity case. The phrase was not new to her. She had heard its like, in her cousin's house, dressed in gentler words, the same verdict underneath. She had thought she had grown a callous over the place where such words landed. She found, standing in the dim corridor, that the callous was thinner than she had believed, and that a thing could be true 100 times over, and still draw blood on the 101st. Yet he set down the book he was not reading, and he sat very still for a long moment, the way a man sits when something has shifted in him that he is not prepared to name. The witnessing came 2 days later, and it came in the nursery, which was a strange place to find the seat of everything, but the house was full of strange corners. There was a child at Wexford, a boy of 6 named Thomas, the son of the Duke's dead sister, kept in the upper rooms with a nurse who drank and a tutor who came twice a week and otherwise left alone. No one spoke of the boy much. He was an awkward fact, a grief with legs, and the house had agreed without discussion to pretend he was being managed. Eleanor had found him on her second day, weeping in a stairwell over a broken toy soldier, and she had mended the soldier with a strip of thread from her workbox, and had begun, after that, to climb to the nursery whenever Cassandra's demands released her, to read to him and to hear his lessons, and to sit with him while the rain came down. On the day of the witnessing, the nurse had gone out, and the boy had taken a fever, and Eleanor had spent the whole gray afternoon at his bedside, with a basin of cool water and a low, steady voice, telling him the stories her own father had told her, naming the constellations on the ceiling that were not there, so that the boy could see them anyway. She did not know that the Duke had come up to the nursery himself, which he did rarely, because he could not look at the boy without seeing his sister's face. She did not know he stood in the doorway for the better part of an hour. She knew only the child and the fever and the rain. She had wrung the cloth and laid it cool against the boy's forehead, and felt the heat coming off him like a small banked stove. And she had been afraid, though she did not show the child her fear, because she had sung to him, low and tuneless, the half-remembered airs of her own childhood. She had told him that the fever was a tide, and that tides went out as surely as they came in, and that all he had to do was float and let it carry him, and she would not leave the shore. The boy had gripped her hand with the fierce, blind strength of the very ill, and she had let him, and her arm had gone numb to the shoulder, and she had not moved it. Outside the rain had thickened to a steady drumming on the slates, and the candle had guttered low, and the afternoon had folded into a gray eternity in which there was nothing in the world but the small, hot hand, and the cool basin, and the steady murmur of her voice. When at last she looked up and saw him there, she rose at once and began to apologize for the liberty, and he raised a hand to stop her, and he said, in a voice she had not heard him use, that she should sit down, that she should not leave the boy, that she had done more in an afternoon than the household had managed in 3 years. Then he turned and went. Before she could see his face change, but the dowager, who had followed her son up the stairs in her rags and stood unseen at the turn of the passage, saw it change completely. She wrote that down too. It was the longest entry yet. Here is the thing the Duke himself did not yet understand, and that I will tell you because you have stayed this long. The reason he could not climb to the nursery was not that the boy reminded him of his sister. It was that the boy reminded him of his own failure to save her. And that failure was the wound at the center of him, the thing the whole cold architecture had been built to wall away. His sister, Lady Cecilia, had married badly and against the family's counsel, and when the marriage soured into something darker, she had written to Henry twice, asking to come home, and Henry, 23 and certain of his own judgment, had written back that she had made her bed. He had meant to teach her a lesson. He had meant her to come anyway, despite his sternness, the way she always had. She had not come. She had died that winter of a fever that took her quickly, alone in a house that was not kind to her. and the boy had been sent to Wexford with a single trunk and his mother's silver thimble in his pocket, which was all anyone had thought to send. Henry had read his own letters back to himself once. Only once, and then he had locked them away, and locked away with them the part of himself that had written them. And he had been cold ever since, because coldness was safer than the knowledge that warmth withheld at the wrong moment could kill. The thimble lived in the boy's pocket still. Eleanor had seen it the first day when she mended the soldier, and the boy had shown it to her, solemnly, and told her it had been his mother's, and that he was not to lose it. She had understood at once that it was the most important thing he owned, and she had sewn a small pocket inside his coat to keep it safe, and the boy had watched her do it with the grave attention of a child being taught that his griefs would be honored. None of the adults of the house knew the thimble existed. The dowager who had given it to her daughter on her own wedding morning did not yet know it had survived. The frost deepened, and so did the strange double current of the house. Eleanor went on serving a woman who despised her and tending a child no one else would tend, and sitting in the evenings with an old beggar who asked careful questions and gave nothing of herself away. And the Duke, who had not sought her out, found that his days had arranged themselves around the chance of seeing her. He came down earlier. He lingered in passages. Once, finding her struggling with a window swollen shut by the damp, he crossed the room and opened it with one hand, and stood a moment too close before he stepped back. And Eleanor felt the warmth of him at her shoulder like a fire she was forbidden to approach, and her pulse betrayed her entirely. "Your Grace," in a voice. She fought to keep level. He said, she ought to ring for a footman rather than fight the windows herself. It was a command. It was a wall built around the window of, "I do not like to see you cold." He stood there a moment longer than the task required, his hands still on the sash, and Eleanor was aware of the heat of him along her whole side, the faint scent of leather and cold air that came off his coat, the way the gray morning light fell across the hard line of his jaw and softened nothing. She did not look at him. She had learned that looking at things she could not have was a habit that cost more than it gave. So she looked at the garden, at the bare black branches stitched against the white sky, and she counted her own breaths until they steadied, and she did not see that he was looking at her, at the curve of her cheek and the cold reddened tips of her ungloved fingers, with an expression that he would have died before letting any other soul observe. Then he stepped back, and the air where he had been went cold again, and he was the Duke of Wexford once more, distant and contained, and only the open window remained as evidence that he had been near at all. The dowager watched the two of them orbit one another and not touch, and she thought of her dead daughter, and she thought of her living son, and she understood that she had come to Wexford to judge a bride and had found instead a question with a far larger shape. She was an old woman in rags, who could, by removing the rags, rearrange the entire field. She did not remove them yet. She wanted Cassandra to show the household exactly what she was, in front of witnesses, by her own choice, so that no one could later say the dowager had engineered it. A truth that is engineered can be doubted. A truth that a person digs for herself, with her own hands in front of everyone, cannot. Cassandra obliged her sooner than expected. It happened over the thimble. The boy, Thomas, recovered from his fever and came down one afternoon to the morning room, which he had been told 100 times not to do, because he had made a drawing he wished to show his uncle. Cassandra was there, and the Duke was not, and the boy, shy and proud, held out his paper to the beautiful woman who was to be his new aunt, because he did not yet know enough to be afraid of her. Cassandra glanced at the drawing and at the child's ink-stained fingers, and at the worn coat with its clumsy hand-sewn pocket, and her face arranged itself into distaste. She told him children belonged upstairs. She told him she could not think why he was permitted to roam the house like a stray. And when the boy, stung, reached into his coat for the one thing that always steadied him and drew out the silver thimble to hold, because holding it helped, Cassandra saw a flash of metal and assumed, in the swift, ungenerous arithmetic of her kind, that the child had taken something. She demanded. He give it to her? He refused. She took his wrist. He cried out. And Eleanor, who had been clearing the grate 2 rooms away and had come at the sound, arrived in the doorway to see Cassandra prying the boy's fingers open over a thing that was his and his alone. What Eleanor did next, she did without calculation. She crossed the room and put herself between the woman and the child, and said quite clearly that the thimble belonged to the boy, that it had been his mother's, and that Miss Bellamy would oblige her by letting go of his wrist. The room held its breath. The beggar woman, on her knees at the far hearth, did not breathe at all. Cassandra released the boy, but only to turn the full weight of her displeasure upon the companion who had dared. She said that the companion forgot herself. She said that a charity case did not give orders to the future Duchess of Wexford. And then, because cruelty unchecked always reaches for more, she said the thing that would prove to be her ruin. She said that the boy was a burden the family would do well to send to a school far away, where he would not embarrass anyone, and that she, for one, would see to it the moment she was mistress of the house. She said it in front of the child. She said it in front of the companion. She said it in front of an old beggar woman she had not troubled to notice, who chose that moment to rise from the hearth. The dowager rose slowly, because her knees were no longer young, and the rags were heavy with the day's ash. But she rose all the way, and she put back her hood, and the morning room, which had been a stage for Cassandra's small dominion, became something else entirely. Eleanor did not understand at first. She saw only that the old woman's bearing had changed, that the bowed shoulders had squared, that the flat begging voice was gone. Cassandra understood faster, because Cassandra had spent her life studying the faces of the mighty, and this face, though she had never seen it, was a face that expected to be obeyed. The dowager said her own name, then, the real one, the one the whole of society knew. And she said it the way one lays down a winning card, without heat, almost gently. She was the Dowager Duchess of Wexford. She had been in her son's house for 11 days, on her knees, in rags, and she had heard a great many things a woman says when she believes the only witnesses are people who do not count. She had washed the floors this woman walked upon. She had carried coal up the back stairs while this woman slept. Until 11, she had knelt at the hearth not 3 feet from where Cassandra took her chocolate and had been spoken of, over her own bowed head, as a thing, a creature, a problem of standards to be raised with the housekeeper. She had let it all wash over her, day after day, because a beggar who answers back is a beggar turned out into the road. And she had needed to stay, and so she had swallowed every slight and added it quietly to the account. Now the account was full. Cassandra's mother had risen halfway from her chair, her mouth working, her hand at her throat, where the morning's pearls suddenly seemed to choke her. The visiting cousin had gone very pale and very still. And Cassandra herself, who had built her whole short reign on the certainty that the people beneath her would always remain beneath her, looked at the old woman, unfolding to her, full height in the center of the room, and understood, far too late, that she had been performing her cruelty for an audience of one who counted more than all the rest of the world combined. And she had just heard a woman propose to send a motherless child away for the crime of existing inconveniently. This is the part where I might ask you to tell me, in a word, what you would have done in that morning room. The dowager did not need a word. She had a whole sentence, and she had been saving it. She did not raise her voice. She told Cassandra that the understanding with her son was at an end, that the Bellamy family would be gone from Wexford by morning, and that the only charity case in the house had been the one wearing diamonds. Then she turned from the woman as though she had ceased to exist, which for the purposes of Wexford she now had. And she went to the boy and knelt again, this time as herself, and she asked him very softly if she might see the thimble. Thomas looked at Eleanor. Eleanor nodded. The boy opened his hand. And the dowager, the great lady who had buried a daughter and crossed an ocean of her own grief to come home, looked at the small, worn silver thing she had given that daughter on a wedding morning a lifetime ago, and for the first time in 3 years she wept, openly, on the floor of her son's morning room, with a beggar's ash still gray on her hands. The Duke came in, then, drawn by the silence, which, in a house, has a sound all its own. He took in the scene in pieces. His mother returned, and unmasked, and weeping on the floor, the thimble in the child's open palm. Cassandra white and rigid by the window. And Eleanor standing where she had placed herself between the great and the small, exactly as she had been standing the whole time, if only he had known how to look. His mother rose and went to him and told him, in a low voice meant for him alone, what she had heard and seen across 11 days. She told him about the charity case who served the scullery maid first. She told him about the blanket on the cold stair. She told him about the afternoon in the nursery. And she told him last what Cassandra had said about the boy, and she watched her son's face as she said it, and she saw the walls she had built in him 3 winters ago begin, finally, to come down. She told it plainly, without ornament, because the plain telling was the cruelest and the kindest both. She told him that she had come home, meaning to look at his chosen bride with a clear eye, that she had expected to find a vain girl and a tolerable match, and had braced herself to hold her tongue. She told him that what she had found instead had broken something open in her that she had thought sealed for good. She had watched a girl with nothing serve a child with no one, asking, nothing, hoping for nothing, simply because the child needed it and she was there. And she had thought, kneeling at the hearth with the ash drying her old hands, that this was what Cecilia had needed and had not received, not from a stranger, not even from her own brother, and that the want of it had cost a life. The Duke did not speak. He stood with his hands at his sides and his jaw set like carved stone, and a muscle moved in his cheek, and his eyes, when his mother looked into them, were the eyes of the young man who had written those 2 cold letters and had been paying for them every silent winter since. The Bellamy carriage left before dawn. The house did not mourn it. What followed was not swift, because Henry was not a swift man in matters of the heart, having taught himself for 3 years to have no heart in matters at all. Yet the architecture had cracked, and through the crack came light, and he found he could not stop it. He began to climb to the nursery himself. He sat with the boy and the companion in the evenings and learned slowly the names of the constellations that were not on the ceiling. He learned that Eleanor had been Eleanor Caro, that she had been a gentleman's daughter, that she had folded her whole former life into a workbox and a single letter, and had never once traded on it for advantage. He learned that the warmth he had walled away had not died after all. It had only been waiting for something worth coming down for. His mother, restored to herself and to her rooms and to the management of a house that had badly missed her, watched the 2 of them with the satisfaction of a gardener who has found beneath the frost-killed bed she came to clear a living root. She did not push. She did not need to. She had learned the hard way, in the matter of her daughter, what came of forcing a heart toward a door. She did, however, one evening, leave the late Lady Cecilia's letters where her son would find them, the ones he had written and the ones his sister had written back, because she had kept them all, and because she believed he needed at last to read the whole correspondence and forgive the young man who had written so coldly out of a certainty he had since paid for in full. He read them. It took him a night. In the morning he was quieter and older and somehow lighter, as a man is lighter who has set down a thing he has carried so long he forgot it had weight. The change in the house showed itself most in the boy. Thomas, who had wept in stairwells, began to laugh in passages. He had a grandmother now, real and present, who told him about his mother as a girl, the dimensions of her mischief, the sound of her laugh. He had an uncle who no longer flinched from his face. And he had Eleanor, who had been the first to climb the stairs to him, and who now climbed them with the Duke at her side, the 2 of them learning together how to be the family. The child had been owed all along. The Duke spoke to Eleanor at last, on a clear, cold morning in the south garden, where the roses had, against all expectation, survived the frost. He did not make a speech. He had never made a speech in his life. He stood with her among the hardy late blooms, and he said that he had spent 3 years believing that to want anything was to risk destroying it, and that he had been wrong, and that the proof had been mending toy soldiers and reading to a feverish child 2 floors above his head the whole time, if he had only had the courage to climb the stairs. He said her name Eleanor, not Miss Vance, not the companion, her own name, in his own voice. And the saying of it was the speech he could not make. The word came out of him roughly, as though it had been a long time since his voice had been asked to carry anything but command, and it hung in the cold, bright air between them. She turned to him then fully, for the first time letting herself look at him the way she had forbidden herself to look at the swollen window weeks before. His breath showed white in the frost. There was a stillness in him. But it was no longer the stillness of a wall. It was the stillness of a man standing at the edge of something he had spent 3 years convincing himself he would never approach again, and finding that his feet had carried him to the brink without his leave, he did not reach for her. He had not earned the reaching yet, and he knew it, and the knowing was the first wholly tender thing she had ever seen him do. She told him the truth, because she would not begin a thing on a half-spoken life. She told him she had nothing, no portion, no name. The world would recognize that she came, with a workbox and a letter and a borrowed coat. He said that he had been rich in everything, but the one quality she had carried up those stairs every day for a season, and that he did not intend to be poor in it any longer. Then he asked her plainly whether she would stay. Not as a companion, as his wife. She thought of her father's letter, of the sentence she had read on so many cage nights that she was worth more than the sum of what she would inherit, and that any man who could not see it was not worth the seeing. She had found at last the man who could see it. She said yes, with her hand already in his, her body answering before her voice, her pulse no longer a betrayal but a confirmation, and he drew her gloved hand to his, and held it there, and the cold morning held the two of them. And neither moved, because what came next did not need to be rushed and could not, once begun, be unmade. They were married in the spring, quietly, in the small church on the edge of the estate, with the dowager in the front pew, and Thomas standing very straight beside her in a new coat, with a careful inner pocket sewn by the bride's own hand. There was no crowd to render a verdict. The only verdict that had ever mattered had been rendered already, in a morning room, by an old woman in rags who had come home to find her son and found, instead, the whole of her family waiting to be gathered up. On the evening of the wedding, when the small party had gone and the house had quieted, the dowager found her new daughter in the nursery, where else, sitting with the sleeping boy. The two women did not speak for a while. Then the dowager took something from her pocket and pressed it into Eleanor's hand. It was the silver thimble. She said that it had gone from a mother to a daughter once before, and that she could think of no one who had earned it more, and that Cecilia, wherever she had gone, would be glad to know whose hand it had come to. Eleanor closed her fingers over the small, worn thing, warm now from the old woman's pocket. And she thought of her own father's letter folded in the workbox in her new rooms. 2 letters now from 2 lost parents, 2 voices saying the same thing across the years, that worth is not the same as fortune, and that the seeing is everything. She did not say all of this to the dowager. She said only, "Thank you," and that she would keep it for Thomas, and one day give it to the woman he chose, if she proved worth the giving. The dowager smiled at that, the slow, rare smile of a woman who has at last set down a long grief and found her hands free, and she said that she had chosen well, both times, the daughter she had lost, and the daughter she had gained, and that Cecilia would have liked her. The 2 women sat on in the dim nursery, the candle low, the boy's breath slow and even in the dark, and neither of them spoke again for a long while, because some quiet is too whole to disturb with words. Outside, the late frost had given way at last, and the first true warmth of the year came up off the garden, and somewhere below a window left ajar, a thrush had begun tentatively to sing. The boy slept, the 2 women sat. And in the quiet, that is the only true reward the world ever offers. The house that had been cold for 3 winters held its breath, and, finding it safe at last, let it go. If this story stayed with you, perhaps you have known a kindness given to someone the world had decided not to see. Carry it with you. The seeing, as Eleanor learned, is everything.